6 years old, my grandfather decided that I needed to hear good music. And in those days, this was 1946, we had a rich, vibrant culture in this community, because during the winter months, the people who came down for the season at the hotel, they didn't come to the Ponce Hotel to stay overnight. They came for the season. So all of these folks who could afford to stay at the Ponce needed to have proper recreation. So we had something called the St. Augustine Music Association. And we met at the Cathedral Parish auditorium. At the time, it was a full-blown auditorium. Now that part of the building is primarily a gym. But 6-year-olds in classical music don't always mix. And so along about 10 o'clock, as the program was coming to a close, I was squirming and wanting desperately to sleep. And about that time, my father jerked me up, and there were 2 wonderful stage doors at the theater, but coming up from the orchestra pit, there was a ladder, whereupon my father pushed me up that ladder, showing my behind to the intelligentsia of St. Augustine, put a bunch of roses in my hands and said, "Sandra, go give the lady the roses and say something nice." I have never had a fear of public speaking from that point on. And I can't tell you how many presentations I've given, but I can flat tell you that none of them has given me as much pleasure as putting together the thoughts that I'm bringing to you today. So, growing up at 18 St. George Street was magical. At that time, St. George Street and King Street were the primary commercial districts for the whole of St. Johns County, except for a business district in Hastings. And so I was in the middle of it all, and I loved it. But I was not the first person to grow up on St. George Street. My father moved to St. George Street when he was a toddler. My grandfather had been the head of the music department at the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. And my father was born at the corner of San Marco Avenue and Genopoli Street, just a stone's throw from here. But about 1910, my grandfather decided to build a hotel on St. George Street. And so he negotiated with Dr. Horace Lindsley to purchase the property at number 20, 22, 24, and 26 St. George Street. Now, later on, I invited people before we started to come and look at the photographs. But you'll see on this photograph, on the left-hand side, that building with the overhang was called the Vetter Curiosity Museum. Now, apparently, that Curiosity Museum had several locations in St. Augustine. Dr. Lindsley was the father of James Lindsley, who became mayor of St. Augustine during the demonstrations here. And his first wife, Lillian Lindsley, was my dancing teacher, to whom I give credit for whatever sense of discipline and purposefulness I have in my life. We called James Lindsley Jinx. That was his first name, and unfortunately it was appropriate because Lillian was killed instantly in a drunken driving accident with Jinx at the wheel. His second wife was Althea, who got hacked to death in her front yard on Marine Street, and that's the basis for Bloody Sunset. So you're going to find out in St. Augustine, the folks that have been here a while are all related one way or another. My grandfather replaced, oh, by the way, the claim to fame of the Vetter Curiosity Museum was Osceola's head, which was separated from his body in South Carolina when he died. And James Lindsley swore to me on a stack of Bibles that yes, Osceola's head was there. While I was in Cambridge at school in the early 90s, I got a call from Pat Whitman, who's a friend of mine, who was at the time the chief anthropologist of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I said, "What are you doing in Boston?" She said, "I'm doing research." And I said, "Research on what?" She said, "Trying to find Osceola's head." The story is that in reality, Vetter had sold the head to a museum in New York, and there was a fire, and the head was destroyed in the fire. But the Seminoles were never particularly interested in accepting that, so that was off and running. Now, Daddy had a magical childhood too on St. George Street. His best friend was Albert Manussi, who was the grandson of Catalina Manussi, who had been a student next door at the schoolmaster's house that is now called the oldest schoolhouse. And Daddy would claim that she would yell at the two of them in Spanish, probably Catalan, but it would give you an idea. At the turn of the 20th century, there were still people in St. Augustine who spoke Spanish as a primary language. One of the great stories I learned about my father when I was growing up came from his other good friend on the street, whose name is Mary Peck. Mary Peck, her family, had a rooming house on St. George Street and a rooming house on Castillo Drive. But Mary was a kid too. And in those days, there was a golf course on the Fort Greene. And according to Mary Peck, Daddy and Albert Manussi and Mary Peck would go over to the Fort Greene and wait for one of the golfers to hit a ball out of line. And they would go and stand on it and offer to sell them another golf ball. So one of St. Johns County's longest serving county commissioner, my father served for 24 years. My upstanding father, the best known historian of St. Augustine, and philanthropist Mary Peck were actually childhood con artists. But for me, it was equally magic to grow up on St. George Street. My grandfather built a 24-room hotel. This would be in the mid-19 teens. And this is what it looked like. This is my grandmother and my grandfather in front of the hotel. The front part of the hotel was a brick hotel, which was a big deal because fire was a big problem for hotels at that time. Most of our guests were people who lived there year-round. And many of the buildings on St. George Street were rooming houses. Now, there's a strange little fact I want to pass on to you today. When I was born in 1940, the population of St. Augustine within the city limits was 14,000 people. In the 220 census, the population of St. Augustine was 14,000 people. Now, the city had been pretty much built out at the time, during my childhood. The growth was always in the county. But what makes the difference is that all along San Marco Avenue, those large Victorian houses today that house restaurants and shops, those were rooming houses. People lived there year-round. As someone who won't see 80 again, I believe that we have lost something for the elderly, because the elderly people who lived in those rooming houses had a kind of care, affordable care, meals, a place to live, and a community that we don't have today. So at the time, there were only two major business streets. One was St. George Street, and the other was King Street. Now, on St. George Street, we had, we had 3 bars. We had 3 department stores. One was the junior shop, which we still have. The Rice family had a department store at 129 St. George Street. And further north on the street, there was something called Manufacturer's Outlet, where they sold seconds and flawed materials. But the Rice, at the Rice department store, every Christmas, they would have Santa Claus. And so, and the children's requests to Santa Claus were broadcast on WFOY. So my babysitter took me to Rice's department store. I'm about 6 years old, and Santa says, "Now, what is your name, little girl?" "I'm Sandra Parks." "And what do you want Santa Claus to bring you?" I said, "I want a donkey and a diamond ring." Now, bear in mind, my grandparents and my mother and my family are all listening to this helplessly. Santa said, "Why do you want a donkey?" And I said, "Because I live at 18 St. George Street and our yard is too small for a horse." And he said, "Why do you want a diamond ring?" I said, "Are you kidding? A diamond ring is one of the most valuable things you can have." Well, needless to say, my parents were not altogether thrilled about this. I did not get a donkey, but my grandfather gave me a baby diamond ring that went down the drain at Orange Street School when I was about 10. So, because we were in the middle of everything, I have great memories of World War II. Bear in mind, I was born in 1940. The war was over when I was 5. But St. Augustine and St. George Street was a swinging place because the soldiers from Camp Blanding and the reserve sailors from Green Cove Springs, where they had a naval facility, would come over to St. Augustine, and I lived right across the street from the Milltop. Now, in those days, the bar was downstairs. The upstairs was something for much more private. But I thought the national anthem was deep in the heart of Texas, or "Don't Fence Me In." I remember that we had blackout curtains. And we also, because St. Augustine was in blackout, I'm told that even the lighthouse just had a small light in it. But the hotel didn't have blackout curtains, but my grandfather had a big canvas roll outside. He would unroll the canvas to make a shade so that the lobby didn't build up heat during the day. But Mama was the staff sergeant of the Women's Ambulance Corps. And that meant that our home, because we were centrally located and our hotel had a parking lot across the street, we were convenient. So I was often the subject of people learning to bandage ankles and bandage wrists. But Mama, and of course Mama had become a trained ambulance driver. And so every hurricane, Mama would deposit my sister and me over in the brick hotel next door with my grandparents, and she'd go off to civil defense to drive military ambulance vehicles through high water. Now, Mama stayed in civil defense all the way into the 60s. Mama was going around St. Johns County trying to convince people who lived 6 feet above sea level that they needed fallout shelters. But I did give Mama's full uniform to the World War II exhibit at the Lighthouse. And Mama kept both the records and the financial records of the Women's Army Ambulance Corps. So I gave all of that to the Florida Historical Society. So I don't remember the end of World War II, but I remember when FDR died, because the only time in my lifetime that I ever saw my father cry was when FDR died. But it was such fun to grow up on St. George Street because everything was there. We had 2 men's shops, H.W. Davis and Kixie's. We had 3 dress shops. The Fiden family had the Lucille shop. The Acris family had a shop there. And the Rogalinas had a small little dress shop up on earlier north on the street. Literally everything was there. Western Auto was the hardware store. The Sherwin Paint Company was there. The dime store was there. We had 2 pharmacies, the St. George Pharmacy, which was one time owned by my great uncle, Dr. Adam Clark Walker. And at the corner of Cathedral Place and St. George was McCartney's. They were kind of the 2 kind of bookends there. And so almost everything you need, you'd find on St. George Street. Just off St. George Street were the 2 government buildings for St. Johns County. At the corner of Hippolyta and Charlotte, where the Columbia Restaurant is now, was the Model Land Company building. Now, those of you that know the story of Henry Flagler know that the Model Land Company was the land acquisition arm of Mr. Flagler's enterprises. And one of the renters in that building was the city of St. Augustine. And so the fire department, the police department, and all of the city offices were right there. And then if you walked a little farther south on St. George Street and 1 street over on Charlotte, we had our county courthouse. It's where the parking lot is now for St. Augustine's sole skyscraper. I ended up spending a lot of time with my father at the courthouse. The year I was born, 1940, he ran for the county commission the first time. He wasn't elected until I'd gone away to college in 1958. But every year, Daddy and I, every election cycle, Daddy and I would have to go out and do things, the politicking that we did then. Now, my mother hated politics, and she never wanted to go to these things. But I was such a pest, she let me go with him. And so to send her regards, she would make rum cake. Because in those days, at every political rally, you had refreshments. So we took rum cakes up to Palm Valley. There wasn't much of Ponte Vedra then. We would take rum cakes out to the fire station at Alpine Grove. And the most fun was to take rum cakes out to Moccasin Branch, because the St. Ambrose Hall was the best political rally in town. But every time, every election night, I would walk down St. George Street with my father to go and stand at the courthouse and wait for the results to come in. And every single time, Daddy and I would walk back up St. George Street, and there never was a victory party at 18 St. George Street, but we did have Mama's rum cake. St. Augustine at the time was, during World War II particularly, was a wonderful place for entertainment. For example, at the northwest end of Francis Field, we had a multi-story wooden baseball stadium. And the St. Augustine Saints were a big deal. And of course, I lived at 18 St. George Street, so my babysitters could take me to the ball game. Now, I can tell you that I can't remember some of the names of the professors I had at Harvard, but I can tell you that in 1949, Lyle Judy and Stan Krupinski played for the St. Augustine Saints. It was a big deal. But the center of community activity was what is now the Visitors Information Center, which was our community center, which was a WPA building. And so during the Second World War, I remember entertainment there because my father had an orchestra and ended up playing for entertainment at the Civic Center. One of them was a womanless wedding. That was apparently popular in World War II. I think they even did one in the film South Pacific. And a minstrel show, neither of which would be politically acceptable today. But it was kind of interesting to see some of St. Augustine's finer citizens dressed up in drag for a womanless wedding. But we had our Halloween carnivals there. It was the center of community life. In 1982, the City Commission decided to lease the building to a developer. And I had done a feasibility study on how we could use the Civic Center as a small convention center and performing arts center. So I had figures. Well, they voted to go ahead and give the building away. And I got so incensed by it that I decided to run for the City Commission against one of the women who had voted to give away our community center. And so I had a 4-year term. I overlapped 2 years with Daddy. And during that time, we were looking for a place for a public library. At the time, it was in the Smith House on Abilene Street. Now, the children's library was about maybe a fourth the size of this room. And the upstairs was the main library. And when I had graduated from high school, I had done a research paper on the remaining members of the Romanov family, and I had checked out a book, a 1906 book called Behind the Veil at the Russian Court. And in 1982, I went back there, and that book was still on the shelf. Only 5 people had checked it out. So I said to Daddy, we've got to do something about this library. I said, Daddy, did you know that the accumulated history of man has doubled 3 times since you used that library as a boy? He said, Sandra, you can't expect that the St. Johns County Library is going to accumulate man's entire knowledge. I said, no, Daddy, but we can make a much better start than we've got right now. So after one of the efforts to have land donated fell, I was on a commission and I met with Jean Luama and Bert Rattray, who were the great heroines that kept the faith to work for the library, and asked, would there be enough room on the back side of Davenport Park to put a library? And so they decided that it was. So Daddy agreed that if the people passed a bond referendum to build it, because obviously the county at the time could not have afforded to build the library out of its existing operating funds, that the city would give the land for the library. Well, on the Halloween before the election, which would be on the first Tuesday of the first month in November, my father was stricken. And my sister and I were called to a hospital in Jacksonville because he wasn't expected to live. So I went up there to see Daddy. I said, Daddy, do you want me to get you a ballot? Well, this was like on a Friday afternoon. My uncle, Gus Thomas, who my father had defeated in 1958 for the county commission, was by that time the supervisor of elections. So I called Uncle Gus, and he opened up the courthouse, went up and got Daddy a ballot. I took it up to the hospital. Daddy realized that somebody was going to have to witness his signing the ballot. And he didn't want it to be me. So he threw the ballot across the room. I said, Daddy, if we don't get a library by one vote, I'm going to be madder at you than I have ever been. But we had no problems passing the referendum, so we got our library. There was a lot to love about being a kid on St. George Street. But the big attraction was the fort. My boy cousins, Bill and Charles Thomas, loved to come to our house because we would go and play on the fort green. Now, we weren't allowed inside, and Daddy's friend Albert Manussi was on the staff there, so we obviously couldn't mess up too much, or Albert would know about it. But if you've been at the fort, you know that in that broad oyster shell rampart that goes all the way around the fort, when you get to the north edge of it, you've got to climb over a couple of stairs before you can come down on the side of the sidewalk to continue on to Water Street. And there's also there stone steps that go down to the grassy area behind the rampart. Well, that was Sandra's castle. So every time we played at the fort, that was the source of where I wanted to be. Well, one day, my cousins came over, and they had the bright idea that what we ought to do was to walk around the base of the fort on a coquina ledge that's about this wide. Now, at that time, there was water in the moat, and there were critters in the moat, and it was slimy. You didn't want to fall in the moat. So, deciding that ladies should go first, I started to inch my way along with my back up against the coquina fort, hoping very much not to trip and fall into the moat. And I had gotten maybe 10 or 15 yards in, and I heard a voice from up above. Sandra Parks, you know you're not supposed to be doing that. Get off my ledge before I call your mother. Whereupon I looked around, and my cousins were nowhere in sight. But the fort was the location of the two great events of my childhood. The first was the snowstorm of 1952. Wow. The snow came down, and it stayed on the ground. And my cousins came in, and we took big sheets of cardboard, and we tried sliding down the slopes of the fort. It's great fun. The snow stayed until about noon, and that was the end of our fun. But the other big hobby at the fort was flying kites. The only activities my father and my sister and I ever did together was either putting together picture puzzles or flying kites on the fort. Now, my father was really picky. He was an aeronautical engineer about kites. It had to be perfect, with just enough tail to keep its balance. And we would go over to the fort, and on any good spring day, the kites above the fort were like a flock of colorful birds, all trying not to get hung up in each other's string. It was absolutely wonderful. The second big event was distant drums. In the 1950s, Raoul Welch, who was a well-known film director, came to town with a movie about the Seminole Wars, and it starred Gary Cooper, Marie Alden, and Quinn. What's his first name? Anthony Quinn. He played the Seminole. Oh, it was a big deal. Donald Capoe's brother, Sidney, got to play Gary Cooper's son because Menorcans looked enough like Indians that he could get by with it. So we all would go over to the fort after school to watch the filming. And in one episode, the Gary Cooper stuntman scaled the side of the fort, which was a big thrill. But the big finale was blowing up the fort. So I have to tell you, Distant Drums is a terrible movie. It's not nearly as bad as Illegally Yours, which was an awful movie that was made in St. Augustine with Rob Lowe many years later. But the fort has always been a part of my life. I had always imagined that someday I was going to meet some wonderful man, and he and I were going to have a wonderful romantic walk on the fort. Never happened. But Mama didn't allow crying in the house. Now, if you saw a movie called Song of the South, it was a musical version of Joel Chandler Harris's books about Burr Rabbit and Burr Fox. And in it, there's a song that goes, everybody's got a laughing place to go, go, go. Well, I had a crying place. Since I wasn't allowed to cry in the house, whenever I would feel overcome, I would take the flashlight at night and go to the fort and go up to Sandra's castle on the north side where there wouldn't be anybody to see me and just let it fly. I've often wondered if anybody ever heard me. They probably thought that what they heard was some ghost down in the dungeon of the fort, when in reality it was just teenage Sandra wailing her angst into the wind. But the fort was also, that was a place where at full moon you really wanted to go. When I was a kid, I believed that the moon was so bright when you had a full moon over the bayfront that it made a road, a golden road, from the water up to the moon itself. So when I was 7 years old, in this room, at the back of my parents' music store, there was a small office. My grandfather had to use the typewriter there because he was blind and people couldn't read Braille. He had to use the typewriter. But if he wasn't there, I was there at the typewriter. I taught myself how to read and write by copying my father's record brochures for the various records that would come out. But I wrote my first poem. It was the first and the last. It goes something like this, which will tell you why it's a great gift, but I didn't follow poetry in life. The moon shines over the ocean. The moon shines over the sea. but when it shines on the bay, it makes a road from it to me. That was it, folks. But World War II brought us all kinds of interesting experiences in St. Johns County. There was a bond drive in the plaza, up in the little cupola there, of hammering nails in Hitler's coffin. And so if you bought your war bonds, you had the chance to take a hammer and go up there and pound the nails in. Well, I was about 4, and my grandfather took me down there to buy war bonds. So we got up to the coffin, and to his horror and dismay, I asked in my loud little girl voice, "Papa, is he really in there?" But the war bonds, my grandfather took out an account for me in the Exchange Bank, which was in the base of that skyscraper downtown, in 1940. And those hammering nails in Hitler's coffin, war bonds, sent me to the University of Florida. And I have had an account in that bank or its successors for 82 years. And I am about as disappointed as I can be that it has moved out of downtown, so that if I have to do my banking, I have to go all the way out to Cobblestone. But World War II affected us significantly. My father had a set of Collier's History of World War II, and that included photographs of the Holocaust. And I knew quite well that in those pictures, those parents were not able to protect their children. Think about that the next time you talk about active shooter drills in elementary schools across this country. And so my cousins and I took it on ourselves that since our parents would not be any more able to protect us than those parents were in those photographs, that we had to do it ourselves. So when I was about 9.5 and Donna was about 4, our plan was the following. Upstairs in our house at 18 St. George Street, under a half-story, there was a playroom. And in the playroom, my father had a giant roll-top desk. So, sanctuary number 1 is I would put my 4-year-old sister in the roll-top desk and put pencils at each end so that you couldn't put the lid down all the way. And then I would go into the storage closet, fearful of the rats that were usually in there, and we would wait there until the Germans went away. But Donna got too big for the roll-top desk after a point. So my cousin Bill and Charles Thomas and I would practice running from the Germans. Now bear in mind, we decided that the Germans would not go, the fort would not be safe because that was a military symbol, and they were going to hang their swastikas from our Spanish colonial towers. That we were going to have to make it to the only place in town that we thought was safe, the steeple of the Catholic Church. And the trick was could we get from the Milltop to the Catholic Church without being seen by the Germans who were goose-stepping up St. George Street. So we climbed over fences and we went through driveways, and it was just fine until we got to an 8-foot wall behind the cathedral. Now we practiced this enough that we got good at it. If you go there today, you can still see the 8-foot wall. And next to it, there is a stone kind of pediment, like a ridge. And so Bill Thomas, who was older than me and stronger than me, he'd go first. So he would put his foot on that stone decoration, and I would push up on his behind, and he would climb up on the wall and straddle the wall. And then we would get to Charles, who was a few years younger and a little bit lighter, and Charles would put his foot up on the stone decoration, and I would push up his behind, and Bill would pull him up from the top, and we would lower him on the other side. And then we could take Donna, who was lighter than all of us, and Donna, same thing, foot on the stone, push on the behind, Bill would take her over the wall, and Charles would help her down on the other side. Now, one day in 1952, we were able to take Simone Browdy to the movies. Now, Simone's mother was very protective, and she was a little child. So she was really entrusting Simone to these children to these young people that she had no idea what they did. And so we followed our rehearsed path. We got to the stone wall. I pushed Simone's behind up. Bill got her on the top, helped her down on the other side, and just as I was going over the wall, I shredded my first set of nylon stockings. But worst of all, down the path came Monsignor Love. Monsignor said, "What are you doing?" I said, "We are rehearsing running from the Germans." He looked down at Simone, he said, "Is it just a little Browdy girl?" I said, "Yes, Father, she's Jewish, you know." Just in case you don't get it, Father. Whereupon he said to me, "Do you think you still need to do this?" Well, I didn't quite figure out whether he meant it's 1952 or you're an adolescent now, it's a little late for these games. But I said, "Well, Father, maybe we should." So that was the end of that experience. You're going to think I got into such mischief. I was such a people pleaser. I can remember these stories because they were so unusual for me to be doing it. Our entertainment, besides the baseball team, was going to the movies. Now, we had a movie palace on Cathedral Place called the Matanzas Theater, and it had a marble ramp hallway that led from the ticket office up to the lobby, and then one would go into this dark, cavernous room, and on either side of the stage where the film was going to be shown were the lights of a small Spanish village. Now, white folks could go in the front. Black folks had to go all the way around the block to the alley by the trade winds and come up the stairs to the lobby. So if Anna Marie, who was our caretaker at our house, took us to the movies, it meant that she would pay for our ticket at the front, and Donna and I would go up the marble ramp and down into the cavernous room, and we would go all the way to the front row. Anna Marie would have to go around the side and up the stairs, and she would come down to the very first row in the balcony, because going to the movie was a crowd in those days, and we were always afraid we'd get separated from her. And so we wanted to be able to see her so that we could connect with her at the other end. Now, the Jefferson Theater was also a large facility. I don't know exactly how black folks got up to the balcony, but I think it was from a stairway off of a hallway on the front of the building. It had the cereals. And so Elizabeth Kaler, who was my best friend, and her little sister, Margaret Jane, who was Donna's age, that's Margaret Jane sitting here, we would go to the movies to see the serials on the weekends. And at the Matanzas Theater, the admission was 14 cents. So when they gave me a quarter, that gave me 10 cents to buy popcorn or candy and 1 penny for bubblegum on the way home. But the Jefferson was a much better deal. It was only 9 cents, and so I had more to spend. But Elizabeth and Margaret Jane lived just a few blocks down here on Garnett Street. And in those days, there was no US 1. There was just a dirt road that ran along the railroad tracks. But we could go over to the Florida Theater, which was over in West Augustine. And that was in the building where a marine supply business is today. I don't ever remember seeing black folks there, but black folks had their own movie theater. And their movie theater was on Washington Street, and the building is still there. And so if you are driving down Washington Street and you pass St. Francis House and then a string of fences, you'll see a concrete building with a door on the second floor. And that was the projectionist booth for the black theater. And so they would run regular films, but they also ran a whole, they would show black films as well. And so movies were, just a huge, huge part of our lives in that period. More entertainment. There were 2 big events a year that were really important to us. The first was the Blessing of the Fleet. And that was a ceremony on Palm Sunday in which the bishop would go down to the waterfront and all the shrimp boats, and in those days there were so many shrimp boats in St. Augustine that I believe you could walk across the San Sebastian River going from one to the other. And in those days, the shrimping industry was dangerous. People died at sea. And so they would bless the fleet, and then they would throw out the wreaths for all those that had died at sea that year. So it was a very, very big deal. Later on, it would become a part of the Easter festival, which also became a big deal. But the other really good event that happened every year was Days in Spain. It was sponsored by the JCs. And sometimes it was held on Adderley Street. At least a couple of times it was held on St. George Street. But since St. George Street was a major thoroughfare, it didn't happen there very often. But all the civic groups would try their best to do something that was sort of Spanish. And so when I was one of the things I remember when I was a really little kid, they had these gigantic puppet-like things that were big papier-mâché heads, and there would be a costume underneath. That was at the Adderley Street show. But when I was in high school as a rainbow girl, we would have various food or things for Days in Spain. Like one year we did fromajardis, which are a Menorcan heritage type savory cheese pie. So when it was on St. George Street, we were baking the fromajardis in Mama's oven and coming out to the road and selling it to the people at the festival. Another time we made something called cascarones, which were basically, we would take an egg, and if you were going to break the egg, you just break off the tip on the end and pour the egg out, and then you would wash it out and put it aside. And then we would take confetti and put it inside the egg and seal the top of the broken part of the egg with crepe paper. And so people would buy these cascarones, and then they would go around and smack on the head of other people, and all the confetti would flow out. But that was just a part of what St. Augustine was like then. It was a community of organizations. You couldn't hope to be elected to anything in St. Augustine if you had not shown the people that you knew what the community needed and you knew what to do about it because you had served the community in one of its many organizations. And so when I was a kid, I started out in Rainbow. I was a bluebird. And this was about late 40s. And apparently at that time, people had begun to hoard food. They remembered rationing, and individuals were buying more food than they needed, and it was ruining the farm economy. And so the Campfire Girls decided on a I won't hoard pledge. So as a little bluebird, I sat at a table in front of the A&P on St. George Street with these petitions of people swearing that they would not hoard. And I was a full-grown woman before I figured out what they were laughing at. But just like our parents, everybody was involved with something, whether it was Kiwanis or Rotary or the Masons or the Knights of Columbus or in the Black community there's both an American Legion, there was a Masonic organization, and there was the Odd Fellows. The Odd Fellows had that tall 3-story condominium on Washington Street. So that was a substantial part of our community. And the same thing was true for us growing up. So after I graduated from Bluebirds and into Campfire, I became a Rainbow Girl, which is a Masonic kind of thing. And we expected to give back. So there are 2 great disappointments of my life in St. Augustine. The first was that our hotel and our parking lot were taken by the state of Florida. We were threatened with eminent domain. To my knowledge, the only person who ever had their property taken by eminent domain in St. Augustine was Mr. Williams, who owned Fort Mose, and the state took that by eminent domain and actually ended up paying much more for the property than they would have if they had just sold it for Mr. Williams wanted. But all of us were along the north part of the business district were threatened with eminent domain because they were going to reconstruct St. Augustine. My father was a part of it. It was going to be a Spanish colonial reproduction, rather like Williamsburg, from the city gates to the plaza. The city was going to move all the business district between King Street and Bridge Street. When I came on the city commission, that neighborhood, which is largely residential, was still zoned commercial. The A&P moved to the Masons building, where Flagler College owns now. The post office moved out of Government House and into its present location. And it was expected that people were going to participate in this. There were 2 organizations. There was the state of Florida, who could take your property by eminent domain, we thought. And there was the St. Augustine Restoration Foundation, which were individual donations. The state owned everything north of Cuna Street. The foundation owned everything south of Cuna Street to Hippolyta, where the Columbia restaurant is today. The organization sunsetted itself. And when a nonprofit sunsets itself, it has to transfer its resources to another nonprofit. So that nonprofit is the St. Augustine Foundation at Flagler College, and that's how it is that Flagler College owns a whole city block of St. Augustine. But the restoration never happened. Now, my father had negotiated with Earl Newton, who was the director of the Preservation Board, that if he would let us alone for Daddy's lifetime, we could keep 18 St. George Street, which was our house. But we had to Spanishify it. We had to build the building all the way out to the street so it would look like it was a Spanish colonial building. When the city was, my sister lived in the property until she died a few years ago. And when the new developer, who is going to put in a mini mall, just what we need for St. George Street. And when the hard board was considering whether the building could be demolished, I spoke in favor of demolishing my family's house because I had written the guidelines by which this is done, and because any real integrity in that building had been destroyed years ago. That's my first disappointment. My second is the loss of community. We no longer in St. Augustine have public places where people can meet, except places like this one. When I was in high school, Margaret Jane Kaler's mother, Geraldine, was on the board of the little theater. This was an active little theater here. And her sister Elizabeth and I worked on a stage cruise. And one of the great treats at the time was to go across to Baron Cotta's restaurant across the street and have such exciting continental cuisine as pizza. But community spaces disappeared. The courthouse moved, the business district, the business districts moved, and this thing called television encouraged people to stay in their houses instead of going out and socializing with other people. It didn't just happen here. There's a great book on the subject called Bowling Alone, which talks about how American culture became so private that people no longer felt the connection with each other that makes for real community life. So today, where do we find community? Today, we must find community among people who share what we care about. I find community with Compassionate St. Augustine, whose director, Arthur Culbert, is right sitting here on the edge. Because these are people who share my values, who give me a chance to give back, to do what good in the world I think I'm called to do. If there's anything I hope we could re-engender in this town, it would be that connectedness with one another in which people who disagree fundamentally about many, many important issues could come together and come to know one another, because we're in our silos, because the organizations that we once enjoyed together are not drawing us to them as they once did. Well, the Friends of the Library are one of those organizations where I find people like me who care about what I care about. And I want to thank the Friends of the Library for giving me this opportunity today. I also need to thank my daughter Jennifer and my friend Gloria Ali, sitting on the front row here, because I could not have done this today without their care. A year ago, I stumbled in the Cincinnati airport and broke bones in both shoulders and both hands. When I was let out of the care facility, I still had 2 splints and 2 slings around my neck that kept me immobile so that my shoulders could heal. When Medicare's allowance ran out, I was sent home not able to do the most basic things to take care of myself. And they did, or I would not have been rehabilitated enough today to be able to be with you. So I hope that these remarks have given you some flavor of what it was like to live in this very remarkable place. I want to thank the ladies who brought in all of these pictures, and Christina and Beth, who were able to get enough easels to put them on. We're going to leave them up for a while so that you can come up and actually see the last of Emmett Fritz's paintings that I have is of 18 St. George Street. This is my Spanish-ified house with my sister standing outside. This is the African-American woman who gave me most of the values in myself that I cherish most. And you can come up and see the music store where Ray Charles used to come and play music with my dad. I loved it, people. Thank you so much. Thank you.